Well, Senator Bernie Sanders is facing backlash following his remarks during a 60 Minutes interview where he renewed his past praise for former communist leader of Cuba, Fidel Castro. Sanders' 2020 campaign manager on MSNBC yesterday addressed how this might affect the Vermont independents' run for the presidency, and Sanders himself defended his remarks during a CNN town hall last night.
Senator Sanders doesn't come to his positions on politics. This comes from a place of conviction. And when you look at what he said for decades, is you have somebody in Fidel Castro who's been a human rights abuser, an authoritarian, as you heard him say in that clip. But nevertheless, you can also acknowledge that there may have been good things happening in Cuban society. So I think what ends up happening is people try to throw these kind of political barbs at Bernie Sanders, and then what ends up being translated to the American public is, oh, there's a person of honesty and conviction who doesn't play politics. He's just telling me truly what he believes. So I don't see any problems or concerns with it.
When Fidel Castro first came to power, which was when, 59? Does that sound right?
59-60.
Okay. You know what he did? He initiated a major literacy program. There was a lot of folks in Cuba at that point who were illiterate. And he formed the Literacy Brigade. You may read that. They went out and they helped people learn to read and write. You know what? I think teaching people to read and write is a good thing.
Okay. What?
I don't even know what to say, Willie. I don't know what to say.
Why?
because he said he has this with every dictatorial regime. He finds something he likes. Like,
who does that remind you?
He had a literacy regime. I mean, but he also had a regime who tortured Catholics, tortured people who worshipped God in a way he didn't like, tortured students that had newspapers, kept people locked up for years, killed people. I mean, and then when Bernie talks about the Soviet Union, they had wonderful chandeliers. Did you see they had wonderful chandeliers in their subways? Like, this is not an argument. Same thing with the Sandinistas. Going down to Nicaragua, talking about the great progress they're making instead of talking about the torturing, instead of talking about... Has there been a communist regime that Bernie Sanders visited that he didn't find something appealing about? You cannot talk about chandeliers in a subway when you're talking about a regime that killed 30, 40 million of its own people, either through forced famines or through torture or through show trials. You cannot talk about Fidel Castro's literacy programs. You just can't. Not in American politics, and you shouldn't be able to, without talking about the long laundry list of evils committed by Fidel Castro against his own people over decades. That is, yes it is, wait for it, that's like saying Mussolini had the trains running. Have you seen the trains? I'm telling you, I'm sitting there by the trains, and it's 2 to 9. And what do I see for my 9 o'clock train? The train's coming up here. Well, people are up on, like, meat hooks, all lined up behind the train. You can't do it. And the fact, I understand, we all say crazy things. It was the 70s and the 80s, right? And the 90s. But he's defending this.
And doubling down.
And doubling down in 2020. That ain't cool, not just with former Republicans. That ain't cool with South Carolina voters. That ain't cool with Democrats.
Ain't cool with Democrats in Florida, and they've made that very clear over the last couple of days.
I will say this, we never know what's going to happen. But I will tell you this, as somebody that knows a little bit about Florida politics, Bernie Sanders will get wiped out in South Florida, which means he will never, like, I'm talking about in the general election, don't know how he'll do in the primary there, kiss Florida goodbye. And and you have
Democratic Congresswoman from Florida. She writes, as the first South American immigrant member of Congress who proudly represents thousands of Cuban Americans, I find Senator Bernie Sanders' comments on Castro's Cuba unacceptable. Donna Shalala echoing that. But as you say, he was confronted with it last night in a town hall on CNN and didn't try to couch it at all. Didn't say, here's what I meant. He repeated it. He said the literacy program was good. And as his campaign manager said, and he's right, Bernie Sanders is consistent on this. He lived it in the 70s, he lived it in the 80s, he lived it in the 90s. They're basically saying he's not going to lie about the way he feels. He's not a politician. And voters will have to make up their minds whether that consistency is a good thing or the fact that you're praising dictators is disqualifying. That'll be up to the voters.
I'm not sure how it's going to come out in the crosstabs here, but I don't think Ortega, Castro, and Stalin fare very well. Their regimes fare very well. Or heck, Brezhnev.
Yeah, I haven't seen a Stalin poll in a while, but I guess it wouldn't come out too well. Here, though, I think when we have talked for the last year or so about Bernie Sanders and his poll numbers, the one thing we keep saying is there is a profound age divide. When you're talking about folks who are under 45 years old and particularly under 30 years old, we saw this in Nevada. He got 66% in Nevada under 30 years old. When you go to the other end of the age spectrum, folks who remember Daniel Ortega, the Sandinistas, those battles of the 1980s, who remember the Democrats in the 1970s, folks like George McGovern, the charge that they weren't, they were a little soft perhaps on communism. That was the charge that was out there in American politics. That was a very difficult position for Democrats like McGovern to be in the 70s. Mm-hmm. Folks who remember that and see that in Bernie Sanders, what you're just showing now, those are the folks who have not been warming up to him consistently in the polls. People who don't have much firsthand memory of the 80s, the 70s, and the 60s, Bernie Sanders is doing very well on.
Yeah, you know, the thing is, though, Willie, that you had in George McGovern a guy who was a war hero.
Yeah.
And a guy that didn't run around talking about what he thought was most intriguing about the Soviet system and how they were all very content. Bernie said they were content. I forget what the exact word was, but there was a level of contentment there among Soviet citizens, said Bernie Sanders, the only person who ever visited the Soviet Union from the West and came back and said that. It's astounding.
This moment is why the White House is licking its chops about Bernie Sanders as an opponent, more than Medicare for all, more than any of those policy prescriptions, because it gets to the heart of something that Donald Trump wants to talk about, which is patriotism, which is, do you love this country? And if he can go out on the stump every day and say, this is Castro's guy, this is Stalin's guy, whatever, you can go down the list, this is Daniel Ortega's guy. He wants to have that conversation desperately, and that's why Donald Trump goes out and says, don't let them steal it from you, Bernie. Congratulations on your big win in Nevada. Now, Donald Trump doesn't have much of a leg to stand on in terms of talking about authoritarians.
Kim Jong-un.
Exactly. But this is a conversation Donald Trump's happy to have.
Yeah, I mean, Sanders has been very good pivoting to that. The question is, why, as a candidate, do you want to take that on? I don't understand that. I mean, why do you want to continue to praise Fidel Castro, a murderous thug? Why do you... Why can't you just come out and say, no, it's terrible?
It's strange.
It is
let's bring
bizarre.
in NBC News national
political reporter. Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.